Welcome to our Devos, where we are talking about a sound mind. The opposite of the deluded mind, which is a symptom of living in the day and age and we're living. We're living in the last days. There's no question about it. There's nothing left that God has to allow to happen before Jesus returns and takes us home in the rapture. There's nothing that needs to happen. However, what we must be aware of is that the spirit of delusion is alive and well. And that delusion often comes from God. Why? You're like, how could that be? Because we want to be deluded. We want to be deluded by this world. That's what we choose. And you see God doing this in the Old Testament when the nation of Israel, when they want certain things, God permits that. And as we pursue our own passions and we eliminate God from our agenda, we find ourselves succumbing to a spirit of delusion. The opposite would be a sound mind. And that's what we're hoping that you focus on. Focus on having a sound mind. The way that you do so is by practicing what we call discernment. Discernment. Discernment is a spiritual gift, but it's also something that we're encouraged to practice on a regular basis. That's when we are looking into a situation, trying to seek God's spiritual perspective on a situation. And meaning we don't believe everything. Practicing discernment, that happens in a lot of different ways. It happens in situations. It happens in how we deal with people and interact with them. We are called by God to love all people. We are called to love even our enemies, even people that persecute us. But there is nowhere that we are called to trust everyone or trust everything. Somewhere along the line, you have this mentality shift where you think that Christians ought to be the most trusting and the most kind of blind following people on the planet. That's just not the case. We're to practice discernment. We're to use logic plus faith plus facts plus track records to prove what the will of the Lord is. Let's take a look at this passage. It's a little bit lengthy. And we're going to talk about this next week as we look at the spirit of Antichrist. But in 1 John chapter 4, John writes, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God." He said, look, everything that's happening isn't good. He says, many false prophets have gone out into the world, but this you know, the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. So let's stop right there. If that thing that you're participating in is glorifying and honoring Jesus, if it's focusing on Jesus, on the gospel, not just Jesus in his name and a pollution of his name, but literally who Jesus really is, what Jesus has really done. He says, whatever spirit does that is from God. But every spirit that does not confess that Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and is now in the world already. He's speaking of a coming time of this Antichrist who is going to be revealed. And he says, but the spirit of Antichrist is alive right now. So, how do we practice discernment? If something is leading you away from the fact that Jesus is Lord, and that he's exclusively Lord, and that Jesus died for the sins of the world, and that Jesus came in the flesh, if you are believing something that is leading you away from that, it is not of God. It is not of God. It is not something that God wants you to do. God wants us to focus our minds on who Jesus is. Jesus not only tells the truth, but he is the literal embodiment of truth. He tells his followers that he is the way, the truth, and the life. The truth in and of itself is embodied in him. So anything that denies who he is, anything that says that, well, maybe he's not really God, or maybe he's not really the Son of the living God, maybe he's not really the one that dies for the sins of the world, anything outside of that is not of God. And this is really, really clear. So if you are involved in something, you're like, well, I'm a Christian, but you know what? I'm super open to other religions, and I'm into tarot cards, and I love astrology, and I'm into these religions where you kind of get into lights and feelings and how energies and all that stuff. It is not of God. It is not of the work of God. It is not glorifying Jesus. It is a spirit of delusion. It's a spirit of Antichrist. And this is what happens a lot of times is we permit. Now, the question comes up is okay, well, as a Christian, what do I have to worry about, right? Because as Christians, we can't be consumed by spirits. We can't deal with spirits in the way that non-Christians do. I have seen Christians open themselves up to evil things, and that evil destroys them. And the reason why they do that is because they're not practicing discernment. They're not testing the spirits according to that which we see in the scriptures. You have to be aware of this. We're living in a very spiritual time right now, and things matter. Your words matter. What you consume matters. What you believe about the Bible matters. It all matters. And the closer we get to the return of Christ, the more the enemy is going to try to dissuade people from believing Jesus is who he says he is. So do not forget to practice discernment.